They share a single forefather. The same man stands at the beginning of both genealogies. Jews call him Abraham. Arabs call him Ibrahim. This is the same man. He lived about 4,000 years ago, somewhere on the border of Canaan and the Sinai Peninsula, and he had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Jews are the descendants of Isaac. Arabs are the descendants of Ishmael. Two sons of one father. So why is the conflict between their descendants one of the longest and bloodiest in human history? This is the first riddle of our investigation, and it is significantly deeper than it appears at first glance. Because this is not simply about two peoples who could not share a land. This is about two peoples who read the same book, the book of Genesis, and see fundamentally different things in it. Two peoples who pray to the same God and yet have waged wars for millennia. But there is a second riddle, even more unexpected. In Islam, Ishmael is a prophet, and it was he who, together with his father Abraham, built the Kaaba in Mecca. Muhammad is a direct descendant of Ishmael. In the Jewish tradition, Ishmael is the firstborn of Abraham, whom God blessed as generously as Isaac, and promised that 12 great tribes would come from him. Both traditions revere Abraham. Both acknowledge that Isaac and Ishmael were brothers. And yet it is precisely this common origin that became not a foundation for unity, but a source of conflict, the roots of which go back to one tent in ancient Canaan. How did this happen? What exactly divided the brothers? And is the division that occurred 4,000 years ago what still defines the relationship between the two peoples? In this video, we will untangle these questions layer by layer. We will return to the very beginning, to a man named Abraham and the story of his two sons. We will look at how this story has been read and interpreted by the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, and how differently they have drawn conclusions about what it means. We will analyze whether there is a historical basis for the idea of the common origin of the two peoples. And we will try to understand why a common father did not become a common foundation for peace. Let us begin with the man. Around the 20th to 18th century BCE, this is the period most scholars date to the era of the patriarchs, though exact dates remain a subject of debate. In the Near East, there lived a man named Abram. He lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the largest cities of Mesopotamia, a center of Sumerian civilization with developed writing, monumental architecture, and complex religious institutions. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was one of the most impressive structures of its time. Abraham came from this world, a world of polytheism, city gods, priestly temples, and ritual order. According to the book of Genesis, God addressed him with a promise that, in its scale, seemed almost incredible. "Go from your country, from your kindred, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham left, at the age of 75, taking his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all his household. He moved to Canaan, the land God had promised him. This promise itself already contains a universal dimension. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Not one nation, all nations. This indicates that the story of Abraham is conceived from the very beginning as a story significant for all humanity. This is what makes him the father of many nations in a theological sense, not merely the ancestor of two specific ethnic groups, but the starting point for a universal religious tradition. It was a story about faith. But within this story of faith was embedded a problem that would in time become a source of division. Because a great nation must have descendants, and Abraham and Sarah had no children. Sarah was barren, and the years passed. It is at this moment, the moment of human impatience in the face of an unfulfilled promise, that the story of the two peoples begins. 10 years had passed since their arrival in Canaan. There were still no descendants. Sarah proposed her solution to Abraham, to take her Egyptian maidservant Hagar as a second wife to bear an heir. This custom was quite normal in the context of the ancient Near East. Cuneiform legal texts from that era described the practice where a barren woman could give her husband a maidservant, and the child born would legally be considered the child of the first wife. Abraham agreed. Who was Hagar? The Torah calls her an Egyptian and Sarah's maidservant. A number of rabbinic midrashim, non-canonical in genre but ancient in origin, claim she was the daughter of a pharaoh, given to Sarah during their stay in Egypt. If this tradition contains a historical kernel, Hagar was a woman of high birth, which would explain her character and readiness to confront her mistress. Hagar became pregnant, and here something changed in her behavior. The Torah says, she began to despise her mistress. Upon learning of her pregnancy, she apparently believed that the status of mother of Abraham's child gave her a special position. Sarah reacted sharply. She complained to her husband. Abraham responded with words that legally defined the situation. Your maidservant is in your hands. Do with her as you please. Sarah began to oppress Hagar. Hagar fled into the wilderness. Here the Torah does something remarkable. It tells the story of the runaway maidservant from her own perspective, with compassion and theological seriousness. In the wilderness, by a spring, an angel appears to Hagar. He commands her to return and submit, but at the same time utters a promise, equal in scale to the promise given to Abraham. I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. You shall bear a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your suffering. Ishmael, Yishmael in Hebrew. God hears. A name that is a theological statement. God heard the cry of this woman, a runaway maidservant, pregnant, alone in the wilderness. And Hagar gave God a name in response, El Roi, the God who sees. The only time in the Torah when a person gives God a name. And this person is an Egyptian maidservant, not belonging to the chosen people. Hagar returned. She bore a son. Abraham was 86 years old. Ishmael grew up in his father's house, apparently perceived as the future heir. 13 years later, everything changed. God appeared to Abraham again and established the covenant of circumcision with him. And this time he said something he had not said directly before. It is Sarah, your wife, who shall bear you a son. Abraham, hearing this, laughed. Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And then he spoke words that reveal the full depth of his love for his firstborn. Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. God answered, It is Sarah who shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant. But as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make of him a great nation. This is the central theological moment of the entire story. God speaks with absolute clarity. The covenant with Abraham will pass through Isaac. But Ishmael is not rejected. He too will be blessed. From him too will come a great nation. He too will have his own destiny and his own place in history. Simply, his path is different. A year passed. At 90 years old, Sarah bore a son. They named him Isaac. He laughs, a name recalling the surprise and laughter of his parents. It was the birth of Isaac that turned what had been a family tension into an open conflict. When Isaac was about 2 years old, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking his brother, or, in another translation, playing with him, and she demanded, "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit with my son." Abraham was greatly distressed, so says the Torah. He did not want this. But God said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named, and I will also make a nation of the son of the slave woman." Abraham gave Hagar bread and a skin of water, and sent her away with her son. In the morning. This is one of the most difficult episodes in Abraham's story. The firstborn, whom he loved, the child's mother, sent away into the wilderness with supplies that clearly would not last long. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water ran out. Hagar moved away, about the distance of a bow shot, so as not to see the child's death. And again the angel called to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. They survived. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness of Paran, a region on the Sinai Peninsula. He became an archer. His mother took a wife for him from Egypt, and from him came 12 sons, 12 princes, who became the founders of 12 Arabian tribes. Isaac remained in Canaan. He married. He became the father of Jacob, the very Jacob whom God renamed Israel. And from Israel came the 12 tribes, the people of Israel, whose history forms the main content of the Old Testament. Thus, the 2 brothers went their separate ways, one into the wilderness, the other into Canaan, one into the history of monotheism as the main narrative, the other into the history of the peoples of Arabia. And here we approach the midpoint of our investigation, and it is time to look at the question posed in the title of this video from a new perspective. Are Jews and Arabs one people? What exactly does this question mean? If it is about biological kinship, then yes, they share a common ancestor. Abraham is the forefather of both. All 3 traditions, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, recognize this. Isaac and Ishmael were brothers. They buried their father together. This is the last moment the Torah describes them together. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. 2 brothers, separated since childhood, at their father's grave. If it is about language, then Jews and Arabs speak languages of the same family. Hebrew and Arabic are both Semitic languages, descending from a common ancestor. The word shalom in Hebrew and salam in Arabic mean the same thing, peace. The word Elohim in Hebrew and Allah in Arabic share the same root. The structures of the languages, word formation methods, many grammatical principles, all this speaks of a deep kinship. If it is about religion, then Islam directly and consciously constructs itself as a continuation of the Abrahamic tradition, inheriting the revelation given to Ibrahim. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the three Abrahamic religions. All three revere Abraham. All three acknowledge that his story is the beginning of their own. And yet, neither linguistic kinship, nor a common forefather, nor belonging to the same religious family has led to unity. Why? The answer given by the biblical text sounds simple. Because already in the first generation, a division occurred that determined different paths. And this division was not accidental, but intentional, at least from the perspective of the text itself. God said to Abraham, "It is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you." This is not merely a preference for one son over another. It is an assertion that the Abrahamic covenant, special relationship with God, special obligations, special mission, would pass through one specific line. Ishmael received a blessing. Ishmael received the promise of a great posterity. But the Abrahamic covenant in its specific content, commandments, Torah, a special way of worship, was transmitted through Isaac. It is this division, and not the personal enmity of the brothers, that is, from a theological point of view, the root of the division of the peoples. They parted not because they hated each other. They parted because they carried different assignments. But here a question arises that is fundamental in this context. Was this division originally conceived as an eternal enmity? The Torah answers this negatively. The conflict between Sarah and Hagar, between Isaac and Ishmael, is a conflict of people, not of gods. God blessed both. God promised both a great posterity. God heard Hagar in the wilderness. God did not turn away from Ishmael. That is why the scene at Abraham's grave, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him, is theologically significant. This is not merely a domestic detail about a funeral. It is a statement that separation does not mean a final rupture. That at their father's grave the brothers stood side by side, that their common origin persisted, even when their paths diverged. In rabbinic tradition, this passage is discussed. Some commentators noted the order of the names, Isaac and Ishmael, despite Ishmael being older. This, in their view, indicated that Ishmael showed respect to his brother by yielding the first place to him. Others saw in Ishmael's very presence a sign that he maintained a connection with his father's house, that the rupture was not complete. It is this distinction, and not the brothers' personal enmity, that is, from a theological point of view, the root of the division of peoples. They diverged not because they hated each other. They diverged because they carried different assignments. Now let us consider how this story is understood by the three traditions, and why their interpretations differ so greatly. In the Jewish tradition, the story of Ishmael is the story of the other son, significant, blessed by God, but not bearing the main covenant. Rabbinic literature treats Ishmael and his descendants with a certain caution, seeing in them a people who live by the laws of strength and independence, which corresponds to the prophecy of the wild donkey of the desert. At the same time, the Midrashim preserved other, warmer details. Some of them recount that Abraham visited Ishmael twice in the desert, that when Ishmael's first wife met her husband's father unfriendly, Abraham conveyed a hint to his son to change the threshold, and he understood. That when the second wife received her father-in-law hospitably, Abraham blessed his son. This is an image of a connection that persists despite separation, of a father who did not forget his firstborn, of a son who did not lose his connection to his father's house. In the Islamic tradition, Ishmael's role is fundamentally different. He is Ismail, a prophet, one in the chain of prophets from Adam to Muhammad. The Quran mentions him in several surahs as a faithful and righteous man. He was true to his promises and was a messenger and a prophet. Surah Maryam 54. It is he, together with Ibrahim, who built the Kaaba in Mecca, Al-Bayt, the house, the central sanctuary of Islam. And when Ibrahim and Ismail were raising the foundations of the house, our Lord, accept this from us. It is said in Surah Al-Baqarah. In this narrative, the expulsion from Abraham's house is not a tragedy, but the beginning of a great journey. Hagar and her son ended up in Mecca. There they survived thanks to a water source, which in Islamic tradition is identified with the Zamzam spring, one of the most important Islamic sanctuaries. There Ismail grew up. There he met his father, whom God had brought to Mecca specifically. And there the two of them erected the Kaaba. From the perspective of Islamic tradition, it is in Arabia and not in Canaan that the Abrahamic mission is fully realized. It is there, through the descendants of Ismail, in the 7th century CE, that the final prophet came and the final revelation was delivered. There is another point on which the two traditions diverge with maximum sharpness. This is the question of whom exactly Abraham nearly sacrificed. The Hebrew text is absolutely unambiguous. It was Isaac. The 22nd chapter of Genesis names him repeatedly. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. This event, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is one of the central theological images of Judaism. For millennia, it has been cited as an argument about Abraham's faith and about God's willingness to accept a sacrifice and at the last moment prevent it. The Quran describes this trial but does not name the son directly. Surah As-Safat speaks of the patient son whom Ibrahim was prepared to sacrifice. Most early Islamic theologians concluded that this son was Ismail, the firstborn, born 13 years earlier. In this interpretation, it was Ishmael who became the submissive one, giving his full consent. And it is this trial that became the basis for the Eid al-Adha, the Feast of Sacrifice, one of the two main Islamic holidays. This divergence, Isaac or Ishmael, is theologically fundamental. It indicates which of the two sons in each tradition occupies the place of the main participant in the relationship with God. And that is precisely why it is not a detail. It is one of the sources of deep mutual misunderstanding between the two traditions. Now let us turn to the historical dimension of the question. Is there confirmation that Jews and Arabs are indeed one people in some objective sense, beyond the religious narrative? From a genetic perspective, the answer is a partial yes. A number of genetic studies in recent decades have revealed significant similarity in the gene pools of several Jewish and Arab populations, especially in the Middle East region. Some population genetic studies show that Sephardic Jews and Middle Eastern Arabs share more genetic markers with each other than, for example, Ashkenazi Jews do with Northern Europeans. This does not mean that all Arabs and all Jews are descendants of a single man, Abraham, but it does mean that both groups share roots in the Semitic population of the Bronze Age Middle East. They emerged from the same genetic pool, even if their paths diverged and intersected over millennia. From a linguistic perspective, also, yes. Hebrew and Arabic are the closest relatives in the family of Semitic languages. They have a vast number of common roots, shared grammatical principles, and a common logic of word formation. The word shalom in Hebrew and salam in Arabic mean the same thing, peace. Shema in Hebrew and Samia in Arabic both mean to hear. Bayit and Beit, house. Yad and Yad, hand. The list could go on indefinitely. A person who knows one of these languages well, upon systematically studying the second, finds familiar structures at every step. This is not a random similarity. It is evidence of a common origin from a Proto-Semitic language spoken by the common ancestors of both peoples thousands of years ago. The very word for God in both languages goes back to the same Semitic root. Elohim in Hebrew and Allah in Arabic. Both are derivatives of the same Semitic root, El or Il, meaning God, mighty. When a Jew recites the prayer, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu, and when a Muslim says, Bismillah ir-Rahman ir-Rahim, they are using words from the same linguistic source to address the same God. From a cultural perspective, also partly yes. Hospitality as a religious duty is present in both traditions and goes back to the image of Abraham himself, who, upon seeing 3 travelers by his tent, immediately rushed to meet them and prepared a feast for them. Respect for elders, the role of family and kinship ties, treating a guest as a sacred duty. In many aspects, traditional Jewish and Arab cultures reveal parallels reflecting common Semitic roots. The traditional cuisine of the Middle East, which the whole world knows today through Israeli and Arab restaurants, hummus, falafel, pita, tahini, is the common cuisine of the region, not divided along ethnic lines. Arguments over who owns hummus are perhaps the most peaceful manifestation of that very conflict, which, in other contexts, takes on completely different forms. The musical tradition of both peoples also reveals common roots. Jewish liturgical music of the Middle East and Arab classical music use similar maqamat, modes, similar ornamental structures, a similar role for improvisation. Listening to the liturgical singing of Yemenite Jews and Arab singers from Yemen, it is difficult not to notice the fundamental similarity in aesthetics. But acknowledging common origin, biological, linguistic, cultural, does nothing to resolve political and religious disagreements. And it is important to understand why here. Because the conflict between Jews and Arabs in its modern form is not a continuation of the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael in a literal sense. This is a statement that is important to make honestly. The modern Middle East conflict has specific historical causes: the end of the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate, waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine in the early 20th century, the Holocaust and its consequences, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, several wars. This is not an eternal enmity predetermined in Abraham's tent. It is a specific modern political conflict with specific historical causes, and reducing it to the biblical story of Isaac and Ishmael would mean making it unresolvable by definition, which does not correspond to reality. Nevertheless, the religious narrative plays a real role in this conflict, not as its root cause, but as one of the languages in which it is described and experienced. And that is precisely why understanding the biblical story of the 2 brothers is part of understanding how each side sees its identity and its place in the shared history. There is one moment in the biblical text that is often overlooked, but which speaks volumes. When Abraham died, the Torah describes his burial with one simple phrase, "And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah." 2 brothers, separated since childhood, living in different places, in different worlds, but when their father died, they both came together, and together they buried him. In Jewish tradition, the rabbis noted the order of the names: Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac is named first, although he is younger. Some saw in this confirmation of Isaac's priority. Others saw something else, that Ishmael yielded the first place to his brother, which, given his proud and independent character, was a significant gesture. But perhaps the most important thing here is the very fact of the meeting. Two peoples, two paths, two different theologies, but at their father's grave they stood side by side. And for those who wish to see hope in this story, and not only predestination, perhaps this moment is the most significant. Abraham is called in Judaism Avinu, our Father. In Christianity, the Apostle Paul calls him the Father of all who believe. In Islam, he is Khalil Allah, the friend of God, Ibrahim al-Khalil, and it is from him that sacred history begins in the Islamic understanding. 3 traditions, 1 father, 2 sons at his grave. Are Jews and Arabs one people? Strictly speaking, no. They are 2 peoples with different languages, different religions, different histories, and different states. But they have something that no other 2 peoples in the world have: the same text about the beginning of their history, the same man at the beginning of their genealogies, the same God whom they address by different names, but with the same conviction in his oneness. Are they one people in the sense of common origin? Yes, to a certain extent. In the sense of a common destiny? Still an open question, the answer to which depends not on a 4,000-year history, but on decisions being made today. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is not a story of predetermined eternal enmity. It is a story of 2 brothers whom circumstances separated, but did not destroy every connection between them. They met at their father's grave. They were both his sons. They both received his blessing. What happens next? That is no longer the story of Isaac and Ishmael. It is the story of their descendants, our story. And it is not yet written to the end. Now let us consider another important aspect: the image of the prophecy spoken over Ishmael. Because it is this prophecy that has been, over millennia, one of the main reasons for disputes about the nature of the relationship between the 2 peoples. The angel said to Hagar, "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in defiance of all his brothers." The wild donkey, Per Adam in Hebrew, literally, a man-wild donkey. The onager, or wild donkey, was well known to the inhabitants of the ancient Near East. This animal, fundamentally untamable, fast, hardy, adapted to life in the desert, and absolutely independent. In the book of Job, the image of the onager is used as a symbol of the boundless freedom of the desert. In the Psalms, as an image of a creature self-sufficient in its element. This is not an insult. It is a description of character, and not the character of an individual, but of an entire people. A people of the desert, independent, free, not subject to subjugation. A people who have their own nature, their own path, their own laws. Medieval Jewish commentators Rashi and Ibn Ezra interpreted this prophecy as a description of the warlike nomads of Arabia, people for whom raiding is a norm of life and independence is the highest value. But even in this interpretation there is no condemnation. There is a statement. Such will be this people. The Islamic tradition, as a rule, did not include this specific prophecy in its interpretations of the biblical text, especially since it is absent from the Quran. But Muslim scholars familiar with the biblical text often interpreted the image of the wild donkey as a description of the proud independence of the Arab character, a trait that in Arab culture is a matter of national pride, not shame. The phrase, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, describes mutual confrontation, a constant state of opposition in which the people of Ishmael will find themselves with their surroundings. Some see in this a prophecy of eternal war. Others, a description of a nomadic way of life, where the line between trade and raid was always fluid. Still others, simply an observation that a people living at the crossroads between great civilizations will inevitably be in constant interaction and conflict with them. What is fundamentally important, this prophecy was spoken over Ishmael before his birth, and yet God heard the prayer for him, saved him in the desert, promised him a great posterity. That is, the prophecy of confrontation does not mean abandonment by God. It is compatible with blessing. Another layer that is important to consider in the context of our question is the history of the 12 sons of Ishmael and what happened to them. The Torah lists them: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Adad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. 12 names, 12 progenitors of tribes. The Torah adds that they lived from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, as you go toward Assyria. This geographical description covers all of northern and central Arabia. Of these 12, some can be historically identified. Nebaioth, likely the Nabateans, a people who created a remarkable civilization centered at Petra in modern Jordan, several centuries BCE. They were builders and traders who created one of the most beautiful cities of the ancient world, right in the rock. Kedar, a tribe well known in Assyrian and biblical sources, living in northern Arabia. The prophet Isaiah mentions it. Bring water to the thirsty, meet the fugitives with bread, you inhabitants of the land of Kedar. The Kedarites, nomads, traders, warriors, whose name became synonymous with Arabs in general in the language of the prophets. It is from these tribes, according to tradition, that after many generations of descendants emerged the people of the Hijaz, western Arabia. It is here in the 6th century CE, in the tribe of Quraysh in the city of Mecca, that Muhammad was born. According to Islamic tradition, his lineage goes back precisely to Ishmael. This is not just a religious legend. It is what Muhammad's own contemporaries believed and what defined his authority as a man from the line of prophets. This is why in Islam the story of Ishmael and Abraham is not a prehistory, but part of the religion itself. Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, reproduces the details of this story. The walking between the hills of Safa and Marwa reproduces Hagar's run in search of water. The circumambulation of the Kaaba reproduces the circumambulation of the house that Abraham and Ishmael built. The sacrifice on Mount Arafat reproduces Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. Thus, every year more than 2 million Muslims physically reproduce the story of Hagar and Ishmael in Mecca. And through this reproduction, they become part of the same Abrahamic history that Jews preserve in their texts and holidays. This is fundamentally important for understanding what these two peoples are in relation to each other. They are not simply different peoples with different gods. They are peoples literally reproducing the same story in different ways. One, through the text of the Torah, prayer, and commandments. The other, through physical pilgrimage to the places where this story took place. A common forefather. A common history. Different interpretations of what it means. Now let's examine another line of our investigation. The attitude of the Christian tradition to this story, and to the question of Jews and Arabs. The Apostle Paul, writing in the 1st century CE to the Galatian communities, used the story of Abraham's two sons as a theological allegory. In his interpretation, Hagar symbolizes the Sinai covenant, the law of the Torah with its demands. Sarah symbolizes the new covenant, a relationship with God based not on fulfilling the law, but on faith and grace. This allegorical reading was of enormous significance for the subsequent history of relations between Christianity and both other peoples. On the one hand, it placed the heirs according to the promise, Christians, regardless of their origin, above the heirs according to the law, Jews observing the Torah. On the other hand, it firmly linked the image of Ishmael with law and slavery, which in later Christian tradition was often used as an argument against Islam. But it is important to understand that Paul himself did not write about Islam. He lived 600 years before its emergence. His allegory was directed against a specific situation in specific 1st century communities. Applying it to the Arab people as a whole or to Islam is a reading that goes far beyond the author's intention. This is why an honest analysis of the question, are Jews and Arabs one people, requires distinguishing 3 levels: historical, religious, and theological allegorical. At the historical level, common roots. At the religious level, 3 traditions inheriting a common history in different ways. At the theological allegorical level, interpretations that have their own meaning in their own context, but are not descriptions of real people and peoples. Conflict between real people unfolds on the first 2 levels, and that is precisely why it cannot be resolved on the 3rd level, through theological allegories. Real people are not symbols of abstract principles. They are people. Let's return to the main question of our investigation, and now consider it from an angle that often remains in the shadows in conversations on this topic. This is the question of what exactly separated Isaac and Ishmael, and whether it was inevitable. If one reads the story carefully, one can notice neither of the 2 brothers is the cause of the separation. Isaac did not feud with Ishmael. Ishmael did not feud with Isaac. At least, the Torah text does not speak of direct enmity. The separation was caused by a conflict between their mothers, and this conflict, in turn, was generated by Abraham's decision, made out of human impatience. The Torah depicts this decision, to take a maidservant to bear an heir, as quite understandable, but at the same time indirectly points to its consequences. Abraham and Sarah did not wait for God's promise to be fulfilled and tried to help it with their own strength. The result was Ishmael. And then God said, "No, Sarah herself will bear you a son." This is a structural motif of the Torah. Human acceleration of God's plan leads to consequences no one planned. This does not mean that Ishmael became a mistake or that he was unwanted. God loved Ishmael. This is stated directly in the text. But the separation that followed was the result not of God's design, but of human impatience. This is why the question, are Jews and Arabs one people, has another dimension that goes beyond history and theology. It is the question of whether the separation is irreversible, whether the conflict is predetermined, or whether, as in the story of the two brothers at their father's grave, something else is possible. The biblical text does not give a direct answer to this question. It ends with Isaac and Ishmael together burying Abraham and parting again. About what happened next in their relationship, the Torah is silent. But the Midrashim preserve a number of traditions that the connection between the two branches of Abraham's descendants was not completely severed. That Abraham visited Ishmael in the desert, that Ishmael honored his father, that the brothers knew about each other. This is not a resolution of the conflict, but it is a rejection of the idea that the conflict is eternal and unchanging. People met, people spoke, people buried their common father. This, too, is part of the history. Now let's consider another important aspect, a topic that in the context of the question, one people, is perhaps the most acute. This is the question of the land. The promise to Abraham included land, Canaan. To your offspring I will give this land. This is one of the key formulas of the Abrahamic covenant. It is this land where Abraham lived as a stranger and sojourner, his own self-definition, that became the center of his promise to his descendants. But here's what is interesting. Hagar and Ishmael ended up not in Canaan, but in Arabia, in the desert of Paran. And God opened Hagar's eyes at the well, not in Canaan, but in the desert. The promise to Ishmael was also not tied to the land of Canaan. His land is Arabia, the space from Havilah to Shur. Thus, initially, Canaan and Arabia were different spaces for different branches of one family. Conflict over one specific land was not embedded in the original separation. It arose later, in specific historical circumstances far removed from the era of Abraham. This, too, is an important observation for understanding the question, one people? They are one people in the sense of a common ancestor, but their original lands did not coincide. Conflict over the same place began later and has specific historical, not metaphysical, causes. Concluding this investigation, it is worth looking once more at the image that best summarizes everything we have discussed. Abraham dies. Two sons, one from Canaan, the other from Arabia, come together and bury their father. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him. The Torah does not describe what they said. It does not describe whether they reconciled or simply performed their duty. Simply, they were both there. They were both his sons. They both came. This depiction of a common father, buried by two sons, brothers separated by childhood circumstances, is perhaps the most honest answer to the question of our investigation. Are Jews and Arabs one people? No. In the political and ethnic sense, they are two different peoples. But they have one forefather. They have common roots in language, in culture, in genes. They have a common history, the history of a family in which there was separation, conflict, but not a complete rupture. They have a common God, whom they call by different names, but who, according to the testimony of the biblical text itself, heard both Isaac and Ishmael. And they, in the historical horizon, have a common fate. Because they live in the same region, breathe the same air, drink water from the same aquifers, Because no exodus, no war, no border can change the fact that their forefathers came from one family. The story of Abraham says there was separation. The story of the two brothers at their father's grave says there was no rupture. And it is precisely this combination, separation and a persisting connection, conflict and the impossibility of a complete rupture, that is perhaps the most accurate answer to the question we asked at the beginning. One people? No. One Father? Yes. And this answer, neither one nor the other, is perhaps the only honest one to a question that humanity has not resolved in 4,000 years, and it seems will not resolve anytime soon. But understanding its origins, understanding precisely how it all began in one tent in ancient Canaan, is a necessary condition for any serious conversation about what this confrontation is and whether it can ever end. Before drawing a final conclusion, it is worth considering one historical paradox that makes the question, one people, even more acute, and which rarely takes center stage in this conversation. For most of their shared history, Jews and Arabs lived side by side, often in greater peace and with greater mutual respect than one might expect from eternal enemies. During the flourishing of the Arab Caliphate, from the 7th to the 12th centuries, Jewish communities in Arab countries experienced one of the most productive periods in their history. It was then in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo, that Jewish scholars worked alongside Arab ones. It was then that Maimonides, the greatest Jewish thinker of the Middle Ages, wrote his major works in Arabic. It was then that the interpenetration of Jewish and Arab intellectual culture arose, leaving an indelible mark on both traditions. Medieval Jewish philosophy, Saadia Gaon, Yehuda Halevi, the same Maimonides, was unthinkable without the Arab philosophical tradition, which traced back to Aristotle through Arab translators. Arabic poetry influenced Jewish liturgical poetry, piyut. Arabic grammar became the model for the first systematic descriptions of Hebrew. This is not romanticization. That period also saw conflicts, restrictions, persecutions. The status of dhimmi, a non-Muslim minority under Islamic rule, provided protection but also imposed restrictions. The relationship was not equal, but it was a relationship of coexistence, cultural exchange, and mutual enrichment, not of permanent war. The current state of relations between the Jewish and Arab worlds is historically atypical, not typical. The acute political conflict over a specific land is a phenomenon of the last 100 years, not of a 4,000-year history. It is this observation that eternal enmity is a myth, not a historical fact, that is one of the most important within our investigation. The myth of eternal enmity is convenient for those who wish to present the conflict as insoluble, because what began with Abraham cannot end with political negotiations. But history shows the opposite. For most of the time that Jews and Arabs spent on the same land or in proximity, they found ways to live alongside each other. This does not mean the existing conflict is simple or easily resolved. It is complex. It has specific causes, political, territorial, religious. But it is not a literal continuation of the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael. It is a modern political conflict which the parties often describe in the language of biblical history. But this is a language chosen for explanation, not the cause of the conflict itself. The last thing to say in this investigation is what the name Ishmael means for today's conversation. Ishmael. God hears. Hagar gave her son this name when she was in the desert, alone, pregnant, without means, in despair. And it was precisely when she thought no one heard her that God heard. El Roi, the God who sees. The name Hagar gave to God in response. The first and only time in the Torah that a person gives God a name, and that person is an Egyptian maidservant, not belonging to the chosen people. These two names, God hears and God sees, are the theological center of the entire story of Hagar and Ishmael. They say this: God sees and hears everyone, not only those chosen for a special covenant, but also those sent away into the desert. God was with Hagar in her suffering. God was with Ishmael when he was dying of thirst. God did not turn away from Abraham's firstborn. This theological assertion, made within the very text of the Torah, is perhaps the most important for understanding how the Jewish tradition actually views Ishmael and his descendants, not as enemies rejected by God, but as people whom God also sees and hears. Simply, their path is different. Are Jews and Arabs one people? The answer depends on what exactly is meant by one people. One family at the beginning, yes. One language? Almost. Shared cultural roots to a significant extent. One destiny? That depends on the decisions made today. For now, Isaac and Ishmael stand at their father's grave. Two brothers. Two different paths. One man they are burying. And each carries within him a part of the promise that was given to him 4,000 years ago. There is another image from this story that deserves separate discussion, because it speaks about the nature of brotherhood more accurately than any theological argument. When Abraham equipped Hagar for the journey in the morning, he gave her bread and a skin of water. This was clearly insufficient for the desert. Abraham knew this, and yet he gave it. Rabbinic literature asks the question, why did such a rich man give so little? And offers an answer. Because giving more would mean acknowledging that they were leaving forever. By giving little, he was as if saying, "You will return. This is temporary." It could have been self-deception, but it could also have been love, a love that could not accept a complete parting. This is a very human image. A person does what he must, sends them away, fulfills his wife's demand, obeys the word of God, but does it as if hoping it is not final, as if leaving the door slightly ajar. Midrash preserves a tradition that Abraham later visited Ishmael in the desert, twice, that they talked, that Abraham gave his son advice, indirectly, through symbolic messages that the son understood, that when Abraham came to Ishmael for the last time, he was at home, and his wife welcomed her father-in-law hospitably. And Ibrahim blessed him, says the Midrash. This is not a canonical story. It is a tradition, but it contains a truth that does not require source verification, a truth about the nature of fatherhood. A father cannot finally renounce his child. Even if circumstances require separation, something continues to draw him to where that child grew up. And it is perhaps in this image of a father secretly visiting his exiled son that the most honest answer to the question, one people, is hidden. Not one people in a political or ethnic sense, but one family, in that deep, irrevocable sense that makes a complete rupture impossible, even when all other conditions for a rupture are met. Families have conflicts. They have separations. There can be years of silence. But a family remains a family. And sometimes, at the grave of a common ancestor, This reminds itself. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him. This is the last thing the Torah says about Ishmael. Then it returns to the story of Isaac and his descendants, and the story of Ishmael recedes into the background of the Old Testament to re-enter history through another book, the Quran, 6 centuries later. But these words at the grave remain. 2 brothers, 1 father, 1 cave of Machpelah in Hebron, a place that to this day is disputed, sacred to both Jews and Muslims, a place where the common ancestor of both peoples rests. Hebron, the cave of Machpelah. There, according to tradition, Abraham is buried. There, according to tradition, Isaac and Sarah are buried. There a mosque is built, and there also a synagogue. There, in one building, Jews and Muslims pray at the same graves. This is perhaps the most precise physical symbol of what Jews and Arabs are to each other. Not one people, not different peoples without connection, but descendants of one forefather who diverged onto different paths, yet inevitably meet where their common beginning lies. 4,000 years, one forefather, and a question that remains open to this day. A final observation, and perhaps the most unexpected of all said today. In the first chapter of our investigation, we asked the question, they have one forefather, so why such a long conflict? We have traveled from Abraham's tent through the desert, through Arabia, through the 3 traditions that inherited this story, and the answer turned out to be more complex than expected. There was a division, but it was caused not by God, but by human impatience. There was conflict, but it was a conflict of mothers, not sons. A blessing was given to both, and neither was revoked. Hagar in the desert opened her eyes and saw a well, and named God, the One Who Sees. Isaac and Ishmael stood together at their father's grave, and that is the last we know of their relationship. None of these facts resolves the modern political conflict, but all of them together say something important about its nature, that it has no theological justification, neither in Jewish nor in Islamic tradition. That a common father is not just a story, but a real connection that cannot be undone. That the conflict began with human impatience, and perhaps only with human patience can it ever be resolved. This is not optimism. It is simply an honest reading of the story with which it all began.